listen-only mode.
Welcome to eGestalt's webinar, HIPAA Solution for Small Businesses. Today's presenter is Jim Hare, VP of Worldwide Sales, eGestalt Technologies. Jim has over 25 years of sales management experience in the emerging high technology marketplace. Jim has spent the last 10 years building successful MSPs across the globe. With many of his MSP partners reaching over $10 million in recurring revenue sales, Jim is an expert in helping channel partners expand into new high-margin recurring revenue lines of business. Jim is also a well-recognized thought leader in software as a service and cloud computing. If you have any questions, please send them via the questions function in GoToWebinar and we will address them at the end of the session. If you would like a copy of the presentation, please send an email directly to Jim. His contact information will be given at the end. Thank you, Jim, for presenting, and I'll turn the webinar over to you now.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. I hope everybody can see my screen. What I'd like to do is cover a couple of things through this session. There's a huge amount of data regarding HIPAA and HITECH and red flags and all of this regulatory stuff. I'm going to hit the highlights. There's a lot of places for research. There's our website, and then just Google search it, and you'll get thousands of pages. And I think that's part of the problem. It's kind of overwhelming. So I wanted to kind of hit the highlights, the key components of what small practitioners, doctors, chiropractors, dentists, and anybody who is involved in healthcare has to face today, and hopefully give you some ideas about how to go after this particular huge market. So we're going to talk about compliance and HITECH, and we're going to talk a little bit about our product and how we address it, and then we're going to talk about some of the types of services that you can offer to this environment. So let's talk about compliance in general. Compliance has gotten somewhat of a bad name as Big Brother, but the reality is compliance is a normal part of having a secure environment. There's really three components to security when you think about it. Firewalls, IDSs, viruses, vulnerability, all of the physical components for securing data. And then you need policies or rules on how you keep that technology current and up to date, updating your vulnerability scans or patches, or when you upgrade or update your iOSs on your firewalls and so forth. So policies or rules are a critical component. And you have to validate that you're following your policies. You can have a policy around a particular firewall or a particular piece of technology in your environment, but if you're not following those policies, then that technology becomes quite useless. So compliance is really just about the following of the policies and procedures and best practices that your organization sets up. The regulatory aspect comes in where they want to see proof that you're following those process and procedures. So that back-end documentation is really where the regulatory aspect comes in. But compliance in general is about keeping your environment secure regardless of whether you're healthcare or anything else. It's about protecting your client data. And one of the problems, the concepts or the theories behind compliance is it's a one-time event. So typically what happens is an organization comes in and takes a snapshot view of your environment in the form of an audit or an assessment, and then they identify the gaps or the areas that are not compliant, and then they put a process and they start the remediation or the repairing of those and get the company in compliance. And compliance typically is probably a little overkill. So by being compliant, traditionally you're going to be more secure, perhaps more secure than necessary, but better than less. The problem is with an audit is it is an event, it's a snapshot in time. And what happens over time is your security profile and your compliance profile starts to degrade. Whether it's days, weeks, or months, it starts to degrade without some kind of recurring type process. So what happens is typically you bring in an audit, you take another snapshot, you start remediation, you get back into compliance, you get back into a good security profile. So that's sort of the fundamental problem that exists today. And what happens is that methodology creates huge gaps in certain times within your environment, so it dramatically increases your risk profile. What's starting to happen, and we're seeing across the board, is the idea of continuous compliance. Very, you certainly wouldn't install a firewall and then not do anything to that firewall for a year, or install virus protection but never do your updates. So the concept of doing compliance once a year is really better than nothing, but still not really a good way to keep your environment secure. So you really want to look at, especially from a channel partner standpoint or a managed services standpoint, some methodology that does continuous type environment. And again, continuous could be, quarterly or monthly or even weekly if the environment's pretty big. It doesn't have to be real time, but it certainly has to be more than once a year. So, why is compliance hot right now? HIPAA has been around for 14 years. I'm sure those of you who have sold into the healthcare environment, when you talk to healthcare professionals, HIPAA was certainly an issue, but really wasn't a concern. They really didn't spend a lot of time, effort, and money in making sure that they were HIPAA compliant. They were concerned about it. But today, we are clearly seeing a dramatic increase in security breaches and loss of data, and that's translating into a significant financial loss for the healthcare industry. Estimates put it at $6 billion annually. So organizations are clearly starting to recognize that protecting their clients' data is a critical component, and compliance will help them get there. And oh yeah, by the way, it's mandated by law. Plus, part of what is driving this is the changes in the regulatory framework. HITECH was ratified in February of 2009 and came into effect, into full force, in February of this year, 2010. And there's some dramatic changes, which we're going to talk about in a second, but there's a number of areas that have really kind of changed the dynamics of the environment. Plus, the single biggest aspect is enforcement. If you talk to, again, a healthcare professional a couple of years ago, there was enforcement, but it was really an obscure organization within the federal government. Now it's being managed or being enforced by the Office of Civil Rights, as well as the Attorney Generals of the states. So you're going to see a very aggressive posture from these guys. So what's the big deal? Why is this so hard? Why are doctors and even hospitals struggling? Why don't they just do it? Why just to be compliant? What's the big deal? Well, truth of the matter is it's hard. It is hard. And I think one of the biggest problems, I've talked to lots and lots of doctors and a couple of dentists, and some other, a couple of chiropractors, and I said, why don't you just become HIPAA compliant? And they honestly said, you know what, we just don't know where to start. We type HIPAA or HITECH in Google, and we get 100,000 pages. So it's overwhelming. When you look at the regulations, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. I don't know which ones apply to me. I don't have the bandwidth to figure that out. So part of it is getting started. And then looking at the number, if HITECH just has so many regulations and they seem so complicated, that's one of the problems is, they look at it and they're overwhelmed by it. It seems too complex to them. And there are many products out there today. Again, you type in HIPAA and you'll get a ton of products. The problem is they are very complex. They are designed for very large environments. Typically Fortune 1000 class accounts. So even a small hospital is overwhelmed, much less a single practitioner or a dentist. So, although there are solutions to help companies become compliant in HIPAA and other regulatory frameworks, they are just very expensive and very complicated. And the other one is, and again, looking at HIPAA, it's they don't think they're going to get caught. But again, they don't realize that the enforcement has changed significantly. The fines have gone up dramatically. And it really comes down to risk. Is it worth the risk versus the time and effort it takes to become compliant? So I think the dynamics have changed quite dramatically over the last 6-12 months, and I think they're going to continue to go towards the area. And the other one is, I talked to a couple of doctors, and they said, we just don't see the value. Well, you know what? I don't see the value in driving 65 miles an hour. I'd rather drive 100. But you know what? It's the law. And whether I like it or not, I have to do it. Now, I can decide that I don't respect that law and I can take my chances. But as we'll see, the risk and the potential financial risk has gone up dramatically. So I think the dynamics have changed, and that creates a great opportunity for channel partners to assist their partners. So why not use a spreadsheet? You know, I'll just take these regulations, I'll put them in a spreadsheet, and I'll answer it. Well, a lot of people do that. In fact, a lot of auditing firms use spreadsheets. However, if you talk to any auditor, and there's not a lot of HIPAA-type auditors yet, although the OCR has been hiring them. But if you look at PCI, the credit card guys, you talk to an auditor, they hate spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are just insecure or unsecure. They are unreliable, and they just don't provide the type of solution that this type of environment supports. And one of the key components, and we're going to see repetitively, that documentation is a critical component of compliance. So having audit trails and the ability to understand how you got to compliance, it's kind of like in school, in a math problem, you could just show them the answer. What they want to see is the work behind the answer. So that's very true in compliance. You have to show the work behind the answer, and spreadsheets just don't permit that. I mean, anybody can change a spreadsheet anytime. It's just very difficult. And the last is, the truth of the matter is, they are actually a hidden cost. You know, the spreadsheet itself may be free, but the labor and the maintenance on it is substantial, even more than many of the relatively expensive tools that are out in the market today. So let's talk a little bit about what HIPAA actually is. First of all, it's critical as a service provider you spell it correctly. I remember going to a CIO of St. Vincent's down down south in Alabama, and he used to tell me that 90% of the channel partners he dealt with couldn't even spell HIPAA. So originally it was a bill that was submitted by Kennedy Castlebaum under President Clinton, and it basically came into law in 1996. And then the HITECH Act was part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and that came into effect in February of 2009 and officially kind of started being enforced February of 2010. And what the ARRA Act had was funding to help organizations convert to electronic medical records. But part of that funding also went to enforcement of compliance. We all know that, you know, manual records that are locked away in a file cabinet and locked in a doctor's office are less likely to be leaked to the public versus electronic, which are floating around out into the world. So the government recognized that by forcing organizations to go to electronic medical records, they significantly increased the potential for loss of patient information. So it was kind of a carrot and stick. There's a lot of funding available from the federal government to help companies get to EMR, but at the same time, they've got to prove HIPAA compliance. So the HITECH Act is in effect now, and all CEs, which are covered entities, we're going to talk about that in a second, and BAs, business associates, must be in compliance. There's a little bit of ambiguity in sort of which laws are in effect today. The truth of the matter is that there's enough of them in place that this is something they must do. And if they're not, they are breaking the law and are at tremendous risk. So in the industry, the people who provide the health care are called covered entities, or CEs. And they are wide and deep. Doctors, anybody that deals with patient data, whether it's a chiropractor or a psychologist or an orthodontist or a hospital or a healthcare provider, HMOs, the list is extensive. So there's a significant amount of opportunity out there. Everybody on this list must be HIPAA compliant and prove it today. There's two components, or there are several components, but they're kind of broken down into two: privacy and security. Privacy basically talks about protecting the patient data and the rights of the patient. And it comes down to a couple of things, that the healthcare provider, the single practitioner, the doctor and the dentist, must have procedures, written procedures, that they must show and educate their employees. So they have to prove this. So part of HIPAA is having the procedures. You have to have the actual procedures. You have to have them in writing. You have to prove you have them in writing. And you have to prove that your employees have gone through training. That means when you have turnover and you bring over new employees, they must go through training. So it's an ongoing process. It's not a one-time event. So at the end of the day, it's protecting client data. I'm sure everybody who's been to a doctor or a hospital has signed a HIPAA form which permits the hospital to give your data to other authorized individuals within the organization and possibly third parties, maybe a pharmacy or a radiology. In a small doctor's office, single practitioner, you have to, in any HIPAA environment, you have to assign at least one person to be responsible for HIPAA compliance, typically the office manager and a single practitioner. And again, the key component here is the policies and the documentation. So it's not good enough to go and do all the right things. You have to prove it. That's what compliance is about. Compliance is the proof that you're actually doing the things you say you're doing. So you have to have a procedure, a written procedure. You have to show that written procedure, and you have to document that you are following that through training dates or other log entries or however. There's a number of ways to document it. So let's talk a little bit about what's changed, what's driving this business. So first of all, it used to be the highest civil penalty was $100. So, you know, honestly, not that they wanted it, but why make the investment? Why spend the time? You know, $100 fine, no big deal. You know, it just kind of wasn't worth the effort to some extent. Now it's $50,000, and by the way, now it's multiple instances, so they can be fined $50,000 several times. Before it was kind of capped at $100, so nobody really cared. Also, on the other side is willful neglect. In other words, the $50,000 limit for a doctor was on accidental. You lost a laptop or somebody broke into your office or whatever. Willful is you disclose information intentionally. Maybe you know, if you're somebody in a healthcare organization and somebody famous comes in and you willfully disclose it or publish it, or you have knowledge of a breach. So as an example, let's assume that an employee loses a laptop and you do nothing about it. That is willful neglect. And what's interesting is there is verbiage in the law about whistleblowing. So your business associate, so if you're a doctor and you're doing business with an IT provider or a CPA or a lawyer or whoever, and they find out about that laptop loss having patient information on it, they are obligated by law to notify the authorities. They basically will warn the single practitioner, and there's a certain amount of time to remedy, 30 or 60 days. If nobody does anything, everybody is under the same umbrella of willful neglect, and there are criminal penalties as well as the fines now can go up to $1.5 million. So this is a very, very serious set of instances. The two other areas that are very, very important is they changed the enforcement agency from an underfunded, obscure area in the federal government to a very aggressive organization, the Office of Civil Rights, and they allow the Office of Civil Rights to keep the fines to self-fund. So they're using the money to hire more auditors and to self-fund, and the OCR is very well known for prosecuting and collecting money. So this is very aggressive policy. Another area is they also allow the state attorney generals to prosecute under HIPAA and HITECH, and they also get to keep the funding. So this is another significant revenue stream, and you know, very localized. So it's going to be more and more aggressive. They also had a clause in the original HIPAA that said that, oh, if you didn't know, okay, you're kind of exempt. They've specifically stricken down that law. So whether you know or you don't know, you're going to be held to the same standard. So it's important that they can't take the attitude of, well, I didn't know. Well, guess what? Doesn't matter anymore. It did actually in the past, but now it doesn't. So they've gotten rid of that. And they put in fairly significant and aggressive criminal penalties for, intentional or knowing about a breach and not taking corrective action. The other thing is that they've extended these requirements to business associates and their subcontractors. So they have the same administrative, technical, and physical security requirements as the covered entities. That's a huge, huge new market. There are approximately, the estimates are 5 to 7 million business associates out there servicing about 1.5 million covered entities. So you're talking a huge, huge set of opportunities for channel partners to go sell services around this environment. So if you look at 6.2.a of the HITECH HIPAA regulation, it clearly says if you're considered a business associate, one, you must have a written contract in place with the covered entity, and they must be able to demonstrate that, and your organization needs to be HIPAA certified, just like your clients. That means if you're an IT service provider and you're servicing healthcare companies, doctors, dentists, doesn't matter, and the key is you have to have some access to patient information, you must be HIPAA compliant. Again, think about the ramifications and the amount of organizations out there that are not HIPAA compliant that are now violating the law. Once the covered entity, the doctor, understands that the business associate is not HIPAA compliant, they have 60 days to remedy, or by law they must cease doing business with that organization or be held in criminal contempt. Under 162.923, they talk about using a business associate and defining what the covered entity must do. And again, comply with all requirements of this part and require any agent or subcontractor of that business associate to comply with all the requirements. So they've restated it multiple places that the business associate is under the same requirements of the covered entity. And again, the key is written. So under 164, implementation written contract required. So that means that the covered entity must have a written agreement in place with the business associates. So what is a business associate? It's a person or entity that performs certain functions or activities that involve the use or disclosure of patient health information. So in other words, if they have exposure to patient data, they are considered a business associate. If there's a copier repairman who comes in and repairs the copier, he probably is not considered a business associate. He probably doesn't have access, but an IT provider and a number of others absolutely do. So, there's a wide range. If you think about who potentially comes under, there's a huge range from claims processing, quality assurance, billing, legal, accounting, and so forth. I have a list coming up that will highlight some of the business associates. So from a channel perspective, think of all of these people are prospects. All of these organizations must be HIPAA compliant. They must figure out a way to get there. So from a general level, the privacy rule requires that covered entities obtain assurances from the business associates. Assurances must be in writing. That's, again, documentation is the key part. So there's probably a lot of service providers that are clearly compliant, but they have no way to prove it. Doesn't matter if they are. They must be able to prove it. So again, documentation is a critical component of compliance. So they must, that the agreements, if they have agreements in place, they need to review them, make sure that they meet them. And again, they face sanctions, fines, loss of their clients, not to mention civil actions. So it is absolutely critical that business associates recognize that they need to be compliant. They need to prove that they're compliant. So here's a short list of examples of business associates, probably a lot of people you hadn't thought of: accountants, lawyers, any third-party administrator, health plan administrators, medical transcriptions, pharmacy benefits, billing service, answering services, document management services, auditors. So there's a huge, huge opportunity here for channel partners to go out and work with business associates and help them become HIPAA compliant. I want to talk to you a little bit about what eGestalt can do to help solve this problem. We've built a product called Secure GRC SB, or Small Business. It's a cloud-based software as a service delivered compliance automation platform delivered exclusively through what we call managed compliance provider partners. So it's a piece of technology that's delivered kind of web type services that you can deliver to your clients. It's a branded solution, so you can put your name on it. There's no hardware or software. There's no agents to deploy. All of the backup and disaster recovery is built in. There's no ongoing maintenance. All of the content, which is critical, is all maintained. So, for example, when the new regulatory act changes next year or new additions come in, we do that automatically. So you don't ever have to worry about are you current, as long as the single practitioner or the doctor, whoever is still subscribing through your services, he's going to have the most current set of regulations out there. And we do it on a repetitive basis. Typically, we're sending out minimally on a quarterly basis new assessments for the single practitioners to make sure that they're maintaining their compliance, and then we push out a monthly set of information that doesn't require a response but gives updates to the healthcare providers. It really does make the covered entities and the business associates' life significantly easier. So if you're a channel provider, why do you want to get into this business? This is a managed service. This is a recurring revenue service. It's very high margin. It's a recurring revenue model. And if you think about what happens when you go into any of these environments, whether it's a covered entity or a business associate, when you install the software and you go through the process, the first thing it's going to do is identify the areas that the healthcare provider is not compliant, also known as a gap. So as a perfect example, one of the key areas that single practitioners especially need to do is have endpoint encryption. So they need their laptops, especially desktops, they should, but probably not a critical issue. They need their desktops to be encrypted. If you look at the statistics, 60–70% of all data loss is from losing a laptop. So it's critical that there's endpoint encryption. So you as a service provider, that's a great piece of technology that you can provide. They probably should have some kind of unified threat management firewall, very low end, whatever, SonicWall, WatchGuard, whatever technology you sell. So the idea is package up all of these components, and we can certainly help you define what technical aspects are required. So when you go and you do the gap analysis with your healthcare customer, you can help remedy or remediate the problem. So lots of nice add-on businesses. This is new. There's really nothing out there today that will address this market. There's certainly a lot of good HIPAA products out there for large hospitals, and we have a great high-end HIPAA product as well. But this is a product specifically designed around single practitioners and small doctors' offices. So very, very high value. And why partner with us versus, I'm sure there'll be companies jumping into this space. It's a big space. It's a hot space. One is we're 100% channel. The competitors that we do compete with on the high end are all direct. They allow channel to buy from, but they're not channel companies. And we basically have a simple, inexpensive solution that you can deliver as your own. And last but not least is an outstanding partner program to help you build this offering and package and sell it. So collateral, data sheets, sample contracts, all of the policies and procedures that a covered entity would need, we provide to you that you in turn can give to them at no charge, or in charge them, I don't care, do whatever you want. We have examples of business associate agreements, all of the components that you need to be successful in this space we provide. HIPAA and any compliance requires, I love this, relentlessly assess. You have to constantly be looking at this. This is not a single event. It's not an annual event. It's a continuous event. By using simple automated technology such as ours, it allows you to continually maintain your compliance, and most important is to protect your customers' data. So we talk about what type of services, after you're running a gap report, that the system will create. In essence, you're going to get a to-do list of technology. It could be things like patches that need to be applied, or firewall configuration problems, or no firewall. Maybe they need new endpoint encryption, or if, depending on their environment, protection, information leakage, or some other security requirements. So they're also going to need, patch management and possibly, depending on the organization, vulnerability and web and application scanner. So there's a huge amount of add-on business here that as a service provider, as a managed service provider, you guys can add at very, very high margin. So let me talk a little bit about, drilling down specifically about individual doctors or small groups, chiropractors, dentists, you name it. The product is basically a web-based technology. It's simple, it's inexpensive. It helps them with their security and their policies. It meets all of the HIPAA high-tech privacy and security requirements. It requires minimal labor to deploy the technology. It helps them and you manage their business associates. But probably the most important is a huge lead generator for you, a very viral lead generator. Let me explain why. So there are millions and millions of companies that fall under covered entities or business associates. So with the technology, what our technology does is it asks the single practitioner or the healthcare provider to list his business associates. And then we ask fundamentally two questions about that business associate. Is one, do you have a written business associate agreement in place? If so, attach it as evidence. What our system does is it basically allows the doctor to attach all of his documentation into a single document repository. So as he goes through the assessment that asks him a number of questions, it's going to ask him to attach evidence. So now you've got a single repository as well as you have a report that shows their compliance status. So it's a nice, easy way for the healthcare provider, the covered entity, to be able to document, maintain his documentation, central repository. The other question we ask is, do you have a copy of HIPAA compliance from your BA? If so, attach. What that requires is that all of the business associates need to provide some form of documentation that shows that they are HIPAA compliant. What you're going to find is most BAs don't have that. So here's an opportunity for the smart service provider to go to their doctor, let's call them Dr. X, and say, hey, Dr. X, you have 6 business associates who have not given you proof of HIPAA compliance. Give me their phone number and I will call them for no charge and get that HIPAA certification for you. So you pick up the phone, maybe it's their accountant, maybe it's their clearinghouse, and you say, hi, I'm with Dr. X. I need a copy of your HIPAA compliance. Of course, they're going to say, well, we don't really have one. Bingo. There's an opportunity for you to take the same product, the same methodology, the same process, go to that BA and sell them this solution. And, of course, then get the remediation, and they now become a client of yours. So now you've gone to the guy's accountant, and you ask the accountant, do you have any other healthcare providers that you do work for? And, of course, he says, yes, I've got 30 doctors that I do accounting work for. You say, I'll tell you what, give me their names. I will call them on your behalf at no charge, and I will give them your HIPAA certification to make sure that you're covered, as well as making sure that there's a business associate agreement in place. So now you pick up the phone and say, yeah, hi, I'm with, Joe the accountant. I need to give you a copy of my HIPAA certification. Did you know that? Oh, you didn't know that. Well, do you have copies of HIPAA certification from everybody else? No, you don't. I can come in and help you. And bing, now you've got another client. So if you think about this, this is a huge viral lead generator. It's probably the single most important aspect. This is just a monster for those smart guys who figure this out. So how do you start? If you're a channel partner, how do you start? Well, probably want to talk to us and take a look and see how we can help you get there. And we'd be happy to sit down and talk to you about a couple of ways to get into this business and how we can help you do that. Here's a key component I want you to walk away with is you are not certifying. You're not a HIPAA auditor. There's kind of really no such thing, but you're not saying you're HIPAA certified. What you're doing is providing the mechanism and providing some expertise to help the covered entity or the BA become compliant. You are at no time under legal obligation to say you are compliant. There's no such thing as a HIPAA certification. Unlike PCI, where there's very specific certification, under HIPAA, if you read the regulations, there is some ambiguity about exactly what is HIPAA compliant. So it's really about best effort, clear documentation. So a key component, you are not certifying them. I'll leave you with this thought that, compliance is, although it's regulatory, it's mandated, there are very nasty civil and potentially criminal, liability. The reality is it's smart business. It's foolish to think that you don't have to take any precautions to protect your patient data. If the covered entity or the business associate loses patient data, they're in a world of hurt, and the laws are very explicit about the quantity. I think it's over 500. If you lose over 500 records, you have to go to the public, you have to go to the state and federal agencies. It's just a mess. You have to notify everybody whose data you potentially have lost. It's a disaster, believe me. It's incredibly painful. So you need to take reasonable precautions. It's just good business sense. Well, thank you. I appreciate your time. And Mike, let's open up the floor to questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim. Like Jim said, we'll go ahead and open the webinar to questions. Please type in your questions in the questions area of GoToWebinar. All right, Jim, here's our first question. What happens if the doctor also requires PCI compliance?
Good question. We have a PCI plug-in module. So if they require HIPAA and PCI, which many do, we have a plug-in module to allow them to do both compliance requirements.
Okay, great. Our next question, how much does this cost?
The way it works is the suggested retail price is probably going to be $500 per year per doctor's login. And then channel partners get a fairly substantial discount. Typically, they're going to be paying around $250 per year per doctor's login. And a doctor's office that has 2 or 3 or 4 doctors may only need one account, so they can get away with one login. There are some minimum volume commitments to go direct with us, but we are in the process of setting up a master MCP, so smaller channel partners can buy quantity 1 without any commitments.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, do I have to be an expert in HIPAA?
That's a great question. No, you don't. The technology basically covers all of the requirements that a single practitioner or any healthcare provider or VA needs. So as long as they follow the menu and the system, that's the intelligence. It doesn't hurt to be HIPAA knowledgeable. But probably more important is IT knowledge around security. How do you secure an environment? How do you do endpoint security? How do you put a firewall in? That's really probably more important than HIPAA knowledge, because the product really covers that for you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question, do you have any household name accounts that can be used as references?
We do, yes. We can certainly talk to our channel partners and give them accounts.
Okay, great. Our next question, are there any cautionary tales of practices being fined large amounts of money that can be used to motivate prospects to action?
Yeah, there's. I can give you a website that posts them all. By law, if there's a breach of over 500 records, they have to make it public, and there's a couple of places that all of this stuff gets posted. There hasn't been a lot of single practitioners. There's been a substantial amount of small hospitals and clinics that have been hit with massive fines and penalties, including a lot of brand name. Rite Aid, the pharmacy chain, got hit with $1 million fine a couple of months ago. So it's definitely happening, and you're going to see it now as the attorney generals get on board. You're going to see a significant upswing in prosecution around compliance.
Okay, we have one last question here, Jim. Is there a method? Oops, actually a couple questions coming in. Is there a method to turn in non-compliant practices to OCR to hasten the sales cycle? All
I like the way you think. Sure. You'd have to have some proof of violation. You can't just say, hey, this guy is not compliant and not have any knowledge. Believe me, you're going to see it more and more in the press. And, let's face it, if you look at any reasonable single practitioner, just general medical, if you went to them, we did this, we went to about 40 different individual doctors, dentists, chiropractors, psychologists, and said, how much would you pay to make HIPAA go away? Would you pay $10,000, $5,000, $2,000, $1,000? We found that they would pay between $1,500 and $2,000 without really thinking about it. They said anything above that, they would probably pay for it, but they'd have to really get a better handle. But anything under that, they would do it. 500, they wouldn't blink. They would do it in a heartbeat if they thought that this would address their HIPAA high-tech requirement. So everybody we talked to was aware of it. There wasn't a single organization, dentist, doctor that was not aware of it, that were concerned about it, but just literally didn't know what to do. Point blank, they all said, I just don't know what to do. A couple of them are working with, a lot of them are affiliated with hospitals. So a lot of the hospitals are starting to work with the doctors to try to help them be compliant, but it's just a very time-consuming, expensive proposition. So, you're going to see it. It's going to happen. I like the thought, though. Great thought.
Okay, one last question here, Jim. Will the gap evaluation help practices find holes in their existing HIPAA policies? Will it make their current IT company possibly look bad?
Well, yes, it will absolutely find gaps in their HIPAA or high-tech compliancy, assuming they have gaps, and trust me, they do. Will it make their IT company look bad? No, I don't think, unless the IT company specifically was going in saying, you're HIPAA compliant, or we're helping you become HIPAA compliant, which I don't know how you have to use an assessment. There's no other way. You can't just go in and so maybe they're secure from a security standpoint. They meet HIPAA compliancy. That's a good job by the IT company, but the IT company wasn't responsible for training the employees. They weren't responsible for providing written policies and documentation to the doctor's offices. So I can't see that it would make them look bad unless they didn't have a firewall and they were just connected directly to the internet through a modem, or they had a firewall and it wasn't set up right. Then yeah, they're going to look bad, and they should.
Great, thanks, Jim. There are no more questions. Thank you for joining us for today's eGestalt webinar, and thank you, Jim, again for presenting. We'll have a recording of the webinar available on eGestalt's website at www.egestalt.com. Thanks again, Jim, and thank you to the attendees, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your day.